Good morning, lovelies. Get out, get in. Let's talk about it. Jesus, coffee. What do you mean, get out, get in, Jim? Well, talking specifically about Israelites getting out of Egypt and getting into Canaan, where they were slaves to bondage. They were in bondage and into slavery, just as we are before we start walking with Christ. We're in slavery and in bondage to sin, right? So get out of there and get into Canaan. And Canaan, for the Israelites, was the land that God promised them. For us, that's heaven. That's eternal life in the kingdom. So the Israelites got out by Moses leading, by God making a way. Dried up the ground, parted the Red Sea. Across they went. And they spun around in the wilderness for 40 years. So we do the same thing. We wander around the wilderness for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I walked around the wilderness till I was 45. Just Moses died in the wilderness. Good morning, my mermaid. Good morning, Janice. Moses died in the wilderness because he couldn't get the people in. He preached and preached and preached about God's faithfulness, but he couldn't get them in. It was actually Joshua that got him in. So I want to go through a passage in Saving Life with Christ. I'm almost done with it. Lee and I are almost finished with it. Fantastic book. But I want to go over how we can get in, because this is really how Joshua got them in, was returning to biblical principles. Returning to the principles of the Word. Right? So it says, we may miss them. We may depart from them. We may misinterpret them. But God's principles do not change. God does not need new methods. God does not need a new technique. He uses any means, any method, any technique. That is immaterial. It is purely secondary. All that is accomplished to God's ultimate satisfaction and of eternal worth, no matter what the means, is always the consequence of a return to its first principles. What are God's first principles? I mean, what are they? So that is why all down the history of the church, every spiritual awakening and every mighty movement of God has been the consequence of a return to the basics teachings of the Bible. And inevitably, in reverse, such a genuine spiritual awakening has always produced Bible-believing Christians. So what are we talking about? What's Major Thomas talking about in first principles? Basic teachings. It's getting in here and believing what's in here. Believing every word of what's in here. Putting your faith and putting your heart and putting everything into what's written here. If you're questioning what's written in here as truth, then you're not returning to your first principles. The Israelites wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't have faith that God would make a way for them. That God would do what God said he would do. But here's something the Israelites didn't know. Had they actually put their faith and trusted in God, they were so afraid of the Canaanites that they just wandered around in the wilderness. And why did you do this? There's people in there. And had they listened, they would have found out that the minute those Israelites were led across the Red Sea, those Canaanites were defeated in the heart. They were actually defeated in the heart. They were already convinced that God was going to deliver them out of this land, because God has delivered these Israelites and has done amazing things with these Israelites. And they were already defeated in their heart. They were just wondering why it took the Israelites so long to get there. Because they didn't have faith to get in. God's principles never changed on getting out, and they never changed getting in. It was faith. It took faith in God to get out, and to watch God do what he does in getting out. And it was watch what God does to get him in. But they didn't have faith to watch what God does to get him in. It took Joshua 3 days to get them into Canaan. What Moses couldn't accomplish in 40 years, and that, guys, don't misread what I'm saying. Please don't. Moses is a pillar of faith, an amazing man. He went face to face with God. An amazing man. He just never went back to the beginning, never went back to the first principles, and died in the wilderness. Was Joshua that much better? That Joshua was able to do something in 3 days that Moses couldn't do in 40 years? No. He just went back to the first principles of trusting in God. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding, because it's going to fail you. But in all your ways, acknowledge him. Trust him. Submit to him. And he'll direct your path. Just like he directed the path of the Israelites. Those Canaanites were already crushed in their hearts. They were just waiting on the Israelites to get there. It took them 40 years to get there. You know, when they came there, fell just like that. And walked across the dry Jordan that they didn't need to walk across. Why? Because they were where they weren't supposed to be. They were never supposed to go across the Jordan. They were already on the right side of the Jordan. They just wandered around the wilderness and got lost. So, go back to the first principles, guys. That's the summation of it. Let's go back to the first principles. Go back to the first principles of faith, which is right here. Stay here. Eat every day from here. Put faith in him, the one who went to the cross. One thing I want you guys to see is Joshua led them in 3 days. In 3 days, they went from being dead in their journey to alive in their journey. Sound like somebody else we know? Do we know somebody else who went from being dead to alive in 3 days? Oh, that's right. Jesus, right? Went from being crucified to resurrected in 3 days. Their walk from dead in the wilderness to alive in Canaan, 3 days. Wow. It's amazing how this book, written by 40 different men, 66 different books, it's amazing how it all tells one story. Right? One story. Coincidence that it took Joshua 3 days to get him into Canaan from the wilderness? No. No, it's not a coincidence. We see the foreshadowing of Christ all over that. We were dead in his... We were dead. Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who lives, but Christ lives in me. And now the life I live in the flesh, I live by faith. First principle. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. Galatians 2:20, the gospel in a box. I love you guys. I don't want anybody walking around separated from Christ. I don't. Go back to your first principles. Go back to your first love, which is God. Give your heart to him. He wants it. That's all he wants. That's all a sinner like me has to give him, is my heart. I don't have anything worthy of a king but my heart. But you know what? That's all he wants. Amazingly enough, that's all he wants. It's pretty cool, huh? He's a pretty simple God. He doesn't want jewels, and he just wants your heart. Give it to him. He made it anyway, right? So, I know he loves you like crazy. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever Dad wants to talk about.